The painting behind me is called Scotland Forever by Lady Grey. As I talked to you this morning, I'd like you to reflect on that painting. Because paintings like this, and maybe a news report, and maybe a smattering of injured soldiers on the streets of London, is all really the public would know about the conflicts that Britain's always been involved in for the last 500 years. Paintings like this were created to capture the essence and to create a sense of romanticism so that we could continue to generate future interest from the public within the military service. Once upon a time, this great island nation of ours, it produced men that would do acts like this, charging towards Russian guns, with a knowledge that probably most of them are going to get killed in the process. Who'd storm beaches under sustained machine gun fire, who climbed out of landing craft, knowing full well that they were running towards their deaths, who flew missions over Europe with odds so low that they wrote letters to their loved ones before they took off. They didn't do it for comfort, they didn't do it for applause, they did it because they believed in something, in their country, in their people, in the idea that some things are worth defending no matter what the cost. Now, in contrast, if Britain called us up today, how many would answer? And more importantly, what would they actually be fighting for? Now, this isn't an attack on any person who's ever served or those men and women who are bravely currently serving. Far from it. Because if anything, and this is controversial, they're carrying a weight far greater than any generation before. Because they're carrying not just the weight of conflict and the trauma that brings, but also the weight of uncertainty that we see consistently every single day. In Britain's standing, in the depletion of the ranks, in the lack of funding of a chronic nature for the last 30 years. Something's changed, not just in the military, but in the nation itself. Let's start with something uncomfortable. Loyalty. Armies aren't built on contracts, they're built on belief. You can train a man how to shoot, you can train him to follow orders, but you cannot train him to lay down his life for his comrades or his country unless he or she believes in something. And belief comes from identity, from shared history, a shared set of values and standards, and a shared sense of we. But what happens when that we starts to fracture? When a nation becomes less a people and more just a collection of different tribes, different individuals with different histories, different loyalties, and a different version of what the country is. Now, let's be clear. I have served with an incredible range of people from all different nationalities, ethnicities, religions, and we continue to have one of the most diverse militaries across the globe. There are many people from all across the empire and all across the world who have served with distinction within the British military. Honour, courage, and absolute loyalty. And I class many of them as my dear friends. That is not a question. What is in question is whether Britain today, as a whole, still inspires that same unified sense of purpose. Because if a nation cannot clearly define what it stands for, it cannot expect people to die for it. And then that leads us on to something even more dangerous, and that's trust. For generations, there was an unspoken contract. A soldier would sign on the dotted line, would take the king's shilling and would do his duty. And in return, the state would stand behind him. If he was injured, he would be looked after. If he was killed, his family would be looked after. If he did his full 22 years, he'd get a pension. But that contract has been eroded. In recent years, we've seen the rise of something that's now been known as lawfare. And this is where the battlefield doesn't end at the end of the conflict, but it follows soldiers, sailors, and airmen home, into courtrooms, into years of investigation, into lives put on hold, not by the enemy, but by ambulance-chasing lawyers within their own system. You see, young men and women are sent to fight in wars that they didn't start, under rules that they didn't write, in environments where split-second decisions mean the difference between life and death. And when they come home, for some it wasn't recognition waiting, it was scrutiny, legal threats, the possibility that everything that they did in the fog of war would be dissected years later by activist lawyers sat in plush officers who'd never served in combat trying to catch them out. Now ask yourself, what does that do to a soldier's mind? Because if he hesitates, he risks his life and the life of his or her brothers and sisters in arms. But then if they act, they risk prosecution and persecution further down the line. That's not strength. That's paralysis. Because whilst this is happening, those that make the decisions, those politicians and civil servants who make the decisions to go to war, rarely or ever face the same level of accountability or scrutiny. So the question becomes, who really carries the consequences of these conflicts that we're undertaking? Because the people are noticing. Nowadays, we live in a world where nothing is hidden anymore. There was a time, like in this painting behind me, where war was something distant and you get a painting or a news clipping, like I said. It was all filtered, packaged, explained to the public in neat, controlled narratives. That time has gone. Now, we see war in real time, on phones, on social media, through the eyes of the soldiers, the civilians, the journalists, the merchant seamen, and sometimes by those who question everything, because for the first time in history, young people are not just hearing about war, they're seeing it, the chaos, the confusion, the information war, the disinformation, the reality that things are not always as simple as right versus wrong, black versus white. And so naturally, they start to ask different questions. Not how do I serve, but why would I serve? And if you want an army to be willing to fight, you better have an answer, because belief is clearly no longer automatic. Trust has to be earned. And on top of that, let's talk about something a little bit more tangible. Capability. I mean, we've all seen HMS Dragon in the news recently, because even if you had the belief, even if you have the numbers, even if we had the unification of all the different groups that now occupy Britain, you still need the tools. And this is where it becomes impossible to ignore. Our country, since Options for Change in 1991, which was a Defence Strategic Review, has seen the military capability on a massive decline. Even when we were in Iraq and Afghanistan, that was all off-the-shelf purchases just to try and keep like that political will going, because people were dying in terrible equipment. And now that we've finished in Afghanistan and Iraq, it's going back down towards that level, because it's just impossible to ignore. We still, in Britain, or the government likes to think of us as this, post-imperial global power, but we never want to fund ourselves like one. And we're constantly hearing about reports of equipment shortages, of units being forced to cannibalise different bits of kit just to keep other bits of kit running. A modern military held together by gaffer tape and improvisation. And there's quite a list of really well-documented issues. There's the HMS Dragon naval readiness. We've got serious limitations because of technical failures on most of the fleet. But then on the land, we've got armoured units, currently facing reductions in numbers, both of personnel and kit. Ongoing challenges around maintaining fully operational tank squadrons. In the air, we've got massive limitations on available helicopters, which impact the mobility of the troops on the battlefield, forcing them to walk and drive through IED-sown areas instead. This is absolutely critical to be able to move people around the battlefield safely in high-intensity conflict. They're not abstract problems I'm talking about. These are real-world limitations, and they matter because modern warfare is not forgiving, and we're seeing that currently in Ukraine and in Iran and many, many other places around the world. Warfare is changing, and we're not keeping up because you don't get second chances with this. If your kit's not ready, if you are not ready to fight in the current environment, you will fail. And so what we're left with is a series of very uncomfortable truths. This nation is now clearly uncertain of its identity. We've got a generation of people coming through who've, in poll after poll, said that they would not be prepared to fight for this country because they see it as an agenda of this group or, this group or this group, and they don't see it about being a patriotic duty anymore. The military also has to operate under such legal scrutiny that people are thinking, well, why would I do that? Why would I set myself up as an old man to be tried in court for something that happened 40 years ago, which is exactly what's happening with the Northern Ireland veterans, and is highly likely to start happening to people that served in Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. You know, we've got a defence system that has been undermined by chronic underfunding, stretched by years of underinvestment, by an MOD that would prefer to get these flashy big bits of kit whilst not paying for the basics that we need to operate. You know, now individually, each of these different causes may be manageable, but together they form something far more serious. Because this is no longer just about defence policy, it's about something deeper. A nation that cannot clearly define itself cannot confidently defend itself. And that leads us to a question that no one seems willing to ask. If the day comes, which it could do very soon, that this country truly needed to be defended, who would stand, not out of obligation, not out of necessity, but out of belief, and what exactly would they believe in? Because in the end, the strength of a military is not just measured in ships or tanks or numbers. It's measured in the willingness of its people, in their hearts, to stand and, if necessary, fall for something greater than themselves. You know, is Britain still strong? Is that even the important question? I think not. I think actually the question should be, is Britain still a country worth defending? And if it is, and this is a question that every single one of us needs to answer, then we need to answer it and be prepared to come together, to unify. And that's newcomers as well as people whose families have got lineage back to, you know, Alfred the Great. We are in this together, and we need to be prepared to stand for Britain over anything else.